Of all the mental shortcuts your brain uses to navigate the chaos of reality, the greatest, and perhaps the most universal, is the grand deception of memory itself. We trust memory implicitly. It's the foundation of our identity, the personal archive that tells us who we are, where we've been, and how we learned the fundamental rules of the world. But now, I want you to try something impossible. I want you to remember your first birthday. Try to conjure a genuine, episodic memory. The feeling of the sunlight, the smell of the room, the sound of a specific voice, or the sight of the cake being placed in front of you. Not a memory based on a photograph or a story your parents told you, but a true, first-person recall of the event. For most of you, that mental search ends in a quiet, frustrating emptiness. You can't do it. Now try your second birthday, or a specific Tuesday afternoon when you were 3, or the feeling of learning to walk. The result is the same. The archive is closed. This is the great paradox of early life. You spent those first 4 years of your existence learning faster than you ever will again. You mastered motor skills, decoded the complex grammar of your native tongue, and built the fundamental emotional framework that defines your adulthood. Yet, the entire period, the most crucial, informative, and dramatic 4 years of your life, has been systematically deleted from your accessible memory. It's not just forgotten, like an old password or the name of a distant relative. It's structurally gone, as if the hard drive was formatted right as you started to become a conscious individual. Neuroscientists call this phenomenon infantile amnesia, and it is one of the most frustrating and counterintuitive mysteries of the cognitive world. It affects nearly every human being on the planet, creating a universal blank slate before the age of 3.5 to 4. What we are experiencing is not a failure of recall, but a structural cognitive process, a necessary, brutal efficiency that fundamentally rewired your entire mental architecture. To understand why your brain erased its own origin story, we have to travel into the parts of the brain that govern both deep storage and rapid growth, specifically a tiny, seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus, and the bizarre, destructive side effects of intense development. To begin, we must differentiate between the two types of memory that define your personal history. When you remember a fact like the capital of France, or the concept that a chair is for sitting, that is semantic memory. It is knowledge, context-free, and purely functional. This memory is active from birth. Infants, in fact, have astounding semantic recall, quickly associating objects with names and sounds with faces. But when you remember the time you spilled juice on your best shirt in kindergarten, where you were, who was there, and how you felt, that is episodic memory. It is an autobiographical recording of a specific event tied to a spatial and temporal context, and this is the memory type that is structurally absent before the age of 4. The neurological mechanism that transforms an immediate, fleeting sensory input into a durable, retrievable episodic memory is the hippocampus. Think of the hippocampus as the critical converter, the filing clerk responsible for taking the chaos of the day and turning it into a structured, indexed archive for the brain's long-term storage areas. But a child's hippocampus is fundamentally unprepared for this complex task. While it's certainly functional, children can remember what happened 10 minutes ago. It lacks the maturity and integration necessary to encode events with the right tags for future retrieval. The first critical error lies in contextualization. To form a stable episodic memory, the memory needs an index card. It needs to be labeled with details like the timestamp, the location, the sensory data, and the emotional tone. The infant and toddler brain, for all its rapid growth, does not yet possess the highly integrated cortical networks required to bind all these separate elements into a single, cohesive, retrievable unit. It can record the sounds and the images, but it cannot effectively connect the who, the when, and the where into a single, searchable file. It's like having a library full of books with no titles, no author names, and no Dewey Decimal System. The information is technically in the system, but the pathways for accessing it on demand, years later, simply do not exist because the initial filing process was incomplete. This explains why one 8-month-old can remember where you hid their favorite toy, but they cannot recall the entire event years later. The short-term memory works. The long-term archival system doesn't. This lack of robust contextual encoding is the first brick in the wall of infantile amnesia. The second and far more dramatic mechanism responsible for this memory void is arguably the most counterintuitive discovery in modern neuroscience. It's the shocking truth that the one thing we associate with growth and learning, the rapid creation of new brain cells, is the very process that destroys our earliest memories. This phenomenon is called neurogenesis. In adult life, neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, occurs sparingly, mostly confined to the hippocampus, and is generally beneficial, helping to integrate new learning and potentially manage mood. But in early childhood, particularly in the period from birth up until about age 3, the rate of neurogenesis in the hippocampus is absolutely torrential. It is a biological explosion, a necessary deluge of new cells flooding the existing circuitry. During this period, the young brain is not simply adding new neurons. It is replacing old networks and massively upgrading its structural hardware to prepare for complex thought, language acquisition, and motor skill refinement. Think of your early memories as software installed on an old, rickety computer. The computer is then disassembled, and a billion new wires and chips are integrated into the exact location where that software was stored. When the system boots up again, the old software file might still physically exist somewhere in the data, but the architectural pathways, the index that led you to the file, have been completely reorganized, scattered, and overwritten by the construction crew. The memories aren't retrieved because the scaffolding upon which they were built was systematically dismantled to build a better structure. Studies, including controversial experiments involving manipulating neurogenesis in mice, have shown that increasing the rate of new neuron creation in the adult hippocampus actually causes amnesia. It actively erases pre-existing stable memories. This strongly suggests that in humans, the high-speed neurogenesis of early childhood acts like a relentless data purge, systematically clearing the slate to optimize the new, powerful memory architecture. It is an act of aggressive, necessary modernization. This neuronal deluge is the great trade-off of development. To gain the highly efficient, logical, and language-dependent memory system of an adult, you must sacrifice the clumsy, unindexed recordings of the infant mind. The brain actively sacrifices its earliest data to create a superior operating system. You are not experiencing memory loss. You are experiencing the final phase of a fundamental structural upgrade. Beyond the physical architecture and the cellular turnover, there is a third, equally critical mechanism contributing to the structural amnesia: the missing narrator. Human long-term episodic memory, the kind that defines our personal history, is intrinsically tied to two things: language and the sense of self. Without these two cognitive pillars, a memory cannot be effectively encoded, stored, or retrieved years later. Consider language first. We don't just use language to communicate. We use it to encode our experiences. When you tell a friend what happened to you yesterday, you are rehearsing the memory, structuring it with a linear narrative, and strengthening its index in your brain. A stable, long-lasting memory needs a narrative structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end, with characters, including yourself, and events. However, the period of infantile amnesia exactly overlaps with the developmental stage before the child has mastered complex narrative language and temporal concepts. A 2-year-old struggles to understand or articulate concepts like last week, tomorrow, or a detailed sequence of events. Since they lack the linguistic toolset to verbally rehearse and organize the experience in a complex way, the memory remains a collection of fleeting, unarchived sensory data. The language that would have stabilized the memory into a coherent, retrievable story simply wasn't available yet. Secondly, and perhaps most profound, is the lack of a fully realized sense of self. To form an autobiographical memory, you must possess the concept that you are an ongoing, stable entity, a conscious agent who experienced the event. This critical sense of self, which allows you to realize, that happened to me, usually consolidates around the same time infantile amnesia begins to lift between 3 and 4 years old. Prior to this, the child is essentially living in a continuous present, experiencing events without the narrative anchor of I. You can see this sense of self forming during the famous mirror self-recognition test, where a dab of paint is placed on a child's nose and they are placed in front of a mirror. Before the age of 2, the child often tries to touch the other child in the mirror. Around 18 months to 2 years, they begin to touch the mark on their own nose, signaling the cognitive jump. They now realize the reflection is a representation of themselves. It is only when this sense of self is solidified, when the I is fully operational, that the brain begins to catalog memories as a continuous, personal story. Without this I, as the central organizing narrator and archivist, the events of early childhood remain unattached to the continuous chain of identity that defines adult memory. So, when we consider why the first 4 years of your life are inaccessible, we are looking at a perfect storm of structural constraints. A developing filing system in the hippocampus that failed to properly contextualize events. A necessary neuronal deluge neurogenesis that aggressively reorganized the neural map and overwrote old data. And finally, the absence of language and a fully developed sense of self, which prevents the memories from being codified into a coherent, retrievable story. This is why, no matter how hard you try, you will never be able to consciously access those episodic events. The memories themselves are not floating somewhere in the deep recesses of the mind, waiting to be unlocked by hypnosis or therapy. They are, for all practical purposes, structurally inaccessible because the cognitive machinery required for their retrieval was entirely different from the machinery you possess today. However, the fact that you can't recall these memories does not mean they have no effect on you. This is the great silver lining and the power of structural amnesia. Your motor skills, your emotional response patterns, your implicit biases, your ability to speak, and your deep, automatic understanding of the world were all forged in those inaccessible years. While the episodic memories, the what, where, and when, are gone, the implicit and semantic memories, the how, the what is, and the feeling remain. You don't consciously remember learning to ride a bicycle, but you know how to do it. You don't remember the exact moment you learned to fear a loud noise, but you react instantly when you hear one. These early, foundational experiences shaped your personality and your nervous system far more profoundly than any memory you formed last week. The inaccessible memories of childhood are not a loss. They are a necessary foundation. To become the efficient, thinking, language-using adult you are today, your brain had to sacrifice the old blueprints. It wiped the slate clean to allow for a superior, structured filing system, ensuring that every memory created after the age of 4 would be organized, contextualized, and anchored to a continuous, stable sense of self. When you look at old childhood photos, you are not looking at lost data. You are looking at the raw, high-speed construction phase, the necessary architectural chaos that created the stable, fully formed cognitive system you use to remember everything else. Infantile amnesia is not a bug. It is the most profound feature of human development, the proof that your brain actively deleted its own origin story to ensure your functional survival.